Hello, I'm Holly Marlow. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. Unfortunately, I can't be there in person today, but I'm really grateful that I'm able to send this video so that I can still be part of this brilliant conference. I'm going to talk to you today about strategies to be more inclusive of traumatised and care experienced children, meaning those who are in foster care, kinship care, or have been adopted. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term, kinship care or special guardianship is when a family member or friend looks after children who can't live with their biological parents. It's most commonly grandparents looking after grandchildren, or sometimes aunties and uncles looking after nieces and nephews. But sometimes kinship families are formed when other relatives or a godparent or another close friend step up to be what we call special guardians for the children. I'm going to cover inclusive language, some topics that might be triggering for care experienced children, and discipline. So just to give you a bit of background about me, I'm a parent. I have one adopted child and one biological child, and I'm an author of several therapeutic children's books to help children to understand different kinds of families. And those books are mostly used in therapy or by parents to help care experienced children to understand what has happened to them. And they're also often used by teachers to normalise different kinds of families, particularly when talking about the family topic in school. So the first area I'm going to cover is the importance of inclusive language. It might take a while to get into the habit of using more inclusive language, but it is worth persevering so that children don't feel isolated in your class. Instead of asking a child to practice their spellings with mum and dad, I'm sure many of you already use a more general term like you're grown-ups. This is more comfortable for children who are in a foster family or a kinship family, and it's also more inclusive of same-sex parent families, single-parent families, and families with parents who identify as non-binary. So if you're not already using a more generic term, it really is worthwhile. It's a small change that doesn't cost anything. In consent forms, you probably don't want to write "you're grown up," but do try to avoid terms like biological parent. That's going to be a really triggering thing for many adopted or foster children to read. And I know many children won't bother reading the letters they bring home, but some will. My 7-year-old does, and these changes are worth making for those children who do read the forms, as well as, of course, being more inclusive towards the adults who will read and return the forms. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but legally step-parents don't have parental responsibility. And for a lot of the consent forms sent home, you will want the adult who does have parental responsibility for the child to sign the form. That's fine, but there is more inclusive language that you can use. I recommend the phrase parent or carer with legal responsibility for the child, just quite simply spelling out exactly what you need. Similarly, a lot of schools now, even now, still have standard forms that list mother and father. So although you won't be creating new forms that say that, it's a really easy mistake to make if you're using an old template to create a new form. So just be really mindful of that and remember to check and make intentional changes to any forms that you're sending home to try to be more inclusive. Next, I'm going to talk about some topics that may be triggering for care experienced children. This is by no means a comprehensive list, and the national curriculum will evolve over time, so it will change. But I'll cover some of the most problematic topics and some simple strategies to make them less triggering for the care experienced children in your class. So first of all, the families topic is an obvious one, and many teachers will ask children to create their own family trees. This can be difficult for lots and lots of children, including those who've lost a parent and those who have complicated families. Bear in mind that some children will have a biological family, one or perhaps more foster families, and an adoptive or kinship family. Some children will have biological siblings who've been adopted into different families, and they may not be able to see them as often as they'd like or at all. And some of their siblings might still be in foster care. Sometimes children are removed from birth parents who go on to have more children, and by then things have changed and they are able to parent those children. That can be really tough for children who find themselves wondering why their birth families have made those changes in time to be able to parent their younger sibling, but they didn't do the same for them. So all of this is the kind of thing that you need to be mindful of, but school is not the place for traumatised children to be exploring what these different family structures mean and how they feel about all of it. Family tree work can be very emotionally triggering for a child who has big feelings about their complex family structure. So a good way to emotionally distance the task from a child's own family tree is to ask the children to create the family tree of a character from a story you've read together or a TV show. Another topic that can be problematic is growing. A common request is for children to bring in photos of themselves as babies and talk about how they've grown and changed and major milestones and life events that have happened to them over the years. And I quite often see at the end of the description of this activity, such as moving house, which seems really quite innocent and innocuous, but it can be a bit emotional, really. If you view that activity through the lens of a care-experienced child who's moved to live with one or more different families, you can understand how talking about major life events can be traumatic for a child who's been removed from their birth family. And even those who were removed at a really young age may remember being in foster care and then having to leave the foster family they loved when joining their adoptive family. Most foster carers and adoptive parents should be talking to their children about these life events regularly to help them to understand their life stories. So you might find that some children happily talk about these topics, volunteer information about their own personal stories. And that can be tricky because you shouldn't completely shut them down. It's great for them to feel that they can share these things about themselves. But you also just need to be careful to avoid turning the conversation into a group therapy session and digging in too deeply. Because a child discussing traumatic events can be far more effective than you realise. They're generally very good at masking, and children will typically feel safest discussing these life events at home with their closest adults or in therapy. A second issue with asking children to bring in baby photos is that some children sadly won't have any. I've known teachers to tweak this activity to ask for photos of when you were younger, but that's not always enough to make the activity inclusive either if a child's recently been adopted and doesn't have access to those photos. There are also going to be children in families who can't get photos printed, whether that's for financial or logistical reasons. It might just be too difficult to organise that in time for the activity. So there are a few alternative ways to explore the topic of growing in a more inclusive way, and I'll run through those now. So first of all, you can use photos of animals at various stages of development instead of humans, which can be very interesting. You can look at generic pictures of humans, and that can be a really great opportunity to be proactively inclusive in other ways, because you can select a variety of pictures of people and intentionally show different colours and different hair types, a range of body shapes and sizes, some disability. You can ask children to help you to order the pictures from youngest to oldest, and you can, along a sort of timeline, and you can discuss how humans change as we age. Or you can pick a celebrity, and that can be another brilliant opportunity because you can pick an inspiring role model, and in some cases you might be able to combine the topic with another part of the curriculum where you're studying a famous artist or scientist and save yourself some time. So that's family and growing, which are the two topics that adoptive parents most commonly report as triggering for their children. One of the most important tips I have is to ensure that parents and carers know when you'll be covering these topics in class, and to be mindful of other topics that might be triggering for a child. You might find that some topics are triggering that you really wouldn't expect to be an issue, so it might even be worth sharing which topics will be covered every week, just at a top level. And then parents and carers can ask you if they want to know more. So strangers and safety is another topic that can be really scary for children who've been removed from birth family and don't necessarily feel fully secure and confident that they won't be moved again. Healthy eating is another one that you may not have thought of, which can be tricky for children who haven't always had consistent access to food. For some children, the very mention of food can send them into a panic state, which won't always be visible. It's important to remember that. So just be mindful of that if children start behaving strangely. And Christmas is a big one. So messages like Santa's watching can be very scary for traumatised children, and children who have a low sense of worth or feel shame deeply can really struggle with the fear that they might not get presents if they don't behave well enough. So it's best to avoid any jokes or comments about how they need to make good choices or they won't get any Christmas presents. You may have seen or even used one of the Santa cams that he sold in the lead up to Christmas. parents and teachers sometimes use them to say, look, Santa can see this bad behaviour, so you better make good choices, otherwise he won't come. I'm not a fan of them for any child, to be honest. My daughter, who wasn't adopted and has had a relatively sheltered life, was terrified at the thought of Santa watching her, and she had nightmares for weeks. So I'm slightly biased against them anyway, before I even looked at them through an adoption-related lens. But for a care experienced child, this sort of thing can be triggering on a deeper level. It can really heighten an underlying fear that they're not safe anywhere, which a lot of care experienced children have. And they can be worried that people can find them wherever they are. They might have been told, you're safe now where you are. Whoever hurt you in the past is not going to find you. So that's the sort of thing that we need to be really, really careful about. It's also well documented that care experienced children experience shame much more significantly and more often than other children. So feeling like someone's watching every little mistake they make, waiting for them to fail and constantly judging them is going to increase those feelings of shame and make it much harder for them to stay calm and regulated, which will affect their focus. And that brings me on to discipline. Public reward-based systems like the traffic light, which is very popular with teachers, can cause some children to feel huge amounts of shame because everyone's performance is shared publicly with the rest of the class and they can see how they're doing relating to everybody else. So this sort of thing puts traumatised children at a disadvantage because, as I mentioned before, they can be significantly more sensitive to shame than other children. And I also mentioned that they can develop excellent masking skills, so you may not see that straight away, so you need to be aware of it. So their fear of getting into trouble can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if they're too stressed to listen to the teacher or to do the activity properly. It's also very important to try to avoid empty threats because a traumatised child will feel unsafe if things aren't consistent. If they think you don't mean what you're saying, they're more likely to have a strong impulse to test whether you'll actually follow through on those threats, and to test what your normal response is going to be to a behaviour if they repeat it over and over again, if they've had a different reaction from you. So we need to be trying to figure out what's driving the behaviour and address that. Is it a fear of failure or rejection? Do they feel left out? Do they think that they're not safe for some reason? For example, have you got a Santa cam watching them? Or is it something simpler? Maybe they're just tired or hungry. They are children after all. So children won't always understand the reason for their own behaviour, as you know, so this can be quite tricky. But addressing the root cause of the behaviour will always be more effective in the long term than a timeout or moving their name label into the red part of the traffic light. And if you can see that a child is starting to struggle, there are a few ways you can help them. Often movement will help them to reset, at least long enough to help them to cope for a bit longer. So a good strategy is to give them something to deliver to a teacher in another classroom. It can be a book or it's just a note in an envelope. Some of you might already use this strategy and have an agreement with another teacher that you send a note back and forth between you, just to help a child to stretch their legs and get some good stress-relieving movements when pushing and pulling the doors on their travels between the classrooms. That can really, really help children who are feeling quite dysregulated. It's a calming motion. Some children will also benefit from sucking a drink through a straw, which is something you can usually access in a classroom. A lot of water bottles have straws built in, or you can bring your own. So you can always suggest that they might be a bit thirsty and perhaps they should have a drink through a straw. If you think you know what's going on, it can be really helpful to name the feelings. So a child can really benefit from knowing that you understand what's happening to their body even when they don't. So you could say something like, Katie, I can see you're feeling really frustrated. Or Zach, you're full of energy. You're finding it hard to sit still today. And it's so helpful to a child. And the important thing is that you should always make it clear that it's their behaviour that that you may have a problem with rather than their child if their behaviour is not acceptable in your classroom. My son was told just last week, actually, that he's becoming a bad child because he's made some bad choices. I suspect those weren't the exact words that were used, but that's how he heard it. And thankfully he mentioned it to me and I was able to repair that a bit by talking about how we all make bad choices and it's not that he is a bad person. But I was really lucky that he told me about that conversation before he sat with those worries for too long. He'd been quite concerned that he actually is a bad child, and told me that he doesn't want to be a bad child. So nobody's perfect. Things are going to slip out like this if a child's doing something that's frustrating to you. And if you're tired, sometimes you just use the wrong words. We all do it. Goodness knows how many times I've corrected myself when filming this already. But the important thing is you need to correct yourself if you accidentally describe a child when you really mean their behaviour. Don't tell someone they're a bully. Tell them that they are doing something that is bullying towards another child. And support their sense of self-worth, because that will really lead to better behaviour. Make sure they know that they're a good person. And it's really good for them to see you correct yourself anyway, so don't be afraid to do that. It's good for them to know that you accept your own mistakes and that you make mistakes. It really helps children to know that even the people they look up to make mistakes. I hope you found this talk useful and that you'll consider how you can make your classroom more inclusive for care experienced children. One last thing I'd like to mention is that I give free talks to school classes, virtual talks if you're not close to where I live, which actually works surprisingly well. And I include a reading of my book, Room in the Nest, which is an inclusive storybook that dips into lots of different types of family at quite a light level, so it shouldn't be triggering to any children. I don't read some of my deeper books that are really for use in therapy or at home with parents. I don't charge for these talks because the goal is to normalise foster care, kinship care, adoption, and lots of different types of families. There's also a same-sex family featured in here, and a single-parent family. I really believe that normalising these different types of family from a young age can help children to be more accepting, and I really hope that will reduce the risk of bullying. So these talks are usually tied into the family topic or PSHE, and I also have a more traditional author talk that I can do before the book reading, which you can tie into literacy. It also includes some motivational aspects about how my chronic pain disability didn't prevent me from following any of my dreams, as cheesy as that sounds. So if you'd like to get in touch to arrange that, or if you have any questions about anything within my talk, please feel free to email me. My email address is holly@hollymarlow.com. Thank you.